This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, decline and victory were in the news this week. The former was evident in Jefferson Parish, where the school board voted to close several schools, and from census data showing a population decline in the state. The victory came on the basketball court, where LSU's women's team won a national championship. We'll discuss why the victory was aided by good players, a good coach, and a 1972 law signed by Richard Nixon. We'll look at these stories as well as a preview of the legislative session that convenes on Monday. And in the Easter holiday's spirit of revival, a look at some ways that contemporary Louisiana politics has performed well. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Stephanie Grace, columnist and editorial director, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, Blake Patterson, staff writer, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and Jeff Adelson, staff writer and data editor, also with the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate. All right, we go over to Steph first.
Yes.
Good to have you here. We haven't seen you in a while. Yes. Legislative session convening next week. What are they going to be stirring up over there?
Okay. Well, let's start with the fact that it will be John Bel Edwards' last session as governor, overseeing the legislature. He always gives a speech to open the legislature. It's the State of the State speech, they call it, so kind of the equivalent in some ways of the State of the Union. And I'm expecting kind of a victory lap from him to talk about, all the things that he thinks he's accomplished and he has accomplished in his 8 years. And it's interesting because, of course, he's a governor and he's going to be looking out at legislators, and it is going to be the most Republican legislature he has faced, or the state has really faced. One thing that's happened since the last time is a guy named Francis Thompson, who's the longest-serving legislator, member of the House, conservative Democrat, became a Republican. And what that means is that there is now a supermajority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate. Before that, it was only the Senate, which means that if John Bel Edwards decides to veto anything and the Republicans stick together, they can override him. Will they stick together? Again, Republicans now have, they're when you're the majority party like that, you kind of have a big tent. So, that doesn't mean they're all going to be on the same page in a lot of issues. There really is kind of a range. So that's the politics of it. The other thing to watch for is that there's a lot of money. I mean, if you go back to when John Bel Edwards first did this, $2 billion deficit, remember that he inherited from Bobby Jindal. They're going to have over this current budget year and next, they're looking at an extra $1.5 billion. So the things we were fighting for, how to pay for basic services, that's not going to be happening. The fight's really going to be, where does that extra money go? Who gets it?
Yes.
So look for conversations about teacher pay raises. I mean, there absolutely will be a teacher pay raise. The question is how high it will be, and will it be across the board, or will there be some money that will be put into, for example, recruiting teachers in hard-to-fill spots, things like that. Early childhood education, there's been a lot of investment, but also there's a big cliff coming because the pandemic, some federal pandemic aid is going to be disappearing. That's been paying for extra spots. And there's really a kind of a big coalition supporting this, from, kind of liberal Democrats to conservative business people who are looking at workforce issues. And, kind of this is something everybody says they support, but, is it a priority?
And the governor has really supported that issue.
The governor has very much supported it.
And so in talking about the finances, the state right now looks like it's in a pretty good financial situation. How long is that going to last?
Well, okay. I mean, how long is the economy going to stay as good as it is? You can debate how good it is. And also there's a tax that's going to roll off after the new governor and legislature take office. This is the temporary sales tax that they passed back in John Bel Edwards' first term, to try to get that deficit.
Right.
To get rid of that deficit, which is what happened. So will it be renewed? Will it just drop off? Will the conditions be worse? And that's coming.
So this 1.6.
I should add one more
Sure.
thing. I think there's going to be a lot of spending on, and that's roads and bridges.
Okay. Yes, I was just going to go there. The infrastructure bill. That money, the 1.6 bill, does not include the infrastructure money that's coming in.
You mean the federal money? Correct. Yeah. So that's just money to the state.
Okay.
So there's match money, and there are local projects, and
So fiscally, okay, it's looking kind of good right now. And as you said, you got to figure out where you're going to spend the money.
Right.
What other issues? Because we've got some important ones facing us.
We do. So it's a fiscal session, but that doesn't mean they're only dealing with fiscal issues. I think that we're going to hear about insurance an awful lot, and that's because it's a huge issue for a lot of voters who aren't able to get property insurance, or whose rates have gone up or have been pushed into Citizens. I mean, this isn't even getting into flood insurance, which is federal, which is a problem too. But there's really kind of a crisis going on now in affordability and availability of property insurance. So they're going to try to address this in a number of ways. There should be legislation to help people get their roofs fortified. This is something that's modeled off of a program in Alabama. And with the idea being that your insurance rates will go down if you have a more solid house. It's hard with the older houses we have here, but the idea is there already is legislation on building standards, but it's just not affordable for people to put on one of these like super strong roofs without public help is the idea. So how much that will be, in what form. There's a proposal. The chair of the insurance committee in the Senate, Kirk Talbot, has floated the idea of making the insurance commissioner's job appointed, not elected. Of course, the long-serving elected insurance commissioner, Jim Donelon, has said he's not running for re-election. Right. There could be some legislation involving kind of lawyers' fees and, the way litigation on insurance happens, modeled on Florida, some kind of conservative, business-friendly legislation. There's even talk that someone, they might try to repeal something that is called kind of the 3-year rule, and that is something that only Louisiana has. It's a really strong consumer protection that if your insurance company is still doing business in the state, and unless you meet some very specific criteria in law, they can't drop you if you've been with the company for 3 years. And this is something that really saved a lot of people after Katrina, when the companies were looking to get rid of their load. But the idea being that insurance companies don't like it, and the way, the argument, the kind of business argument is the way to rebuild the market is to attract more companies, and then they'll compete with each other. So this would be one way.
And we do have a problem with the market right now, that's for sure. All right, Stephanie. Well, it starts Monday, goes Monday to the beginning of June, right? So we'll be hearing a lot coming out of Baton Rouge over the next couple of months. Thanks a lot, Steph. Good seeing you too.
Thanks.
Blake, over to you. Jefferson Parish Schools. So the board made the decision to make some changes, and boy, a lot of people are not too pleased.
That's right. Anytime you're closing schools, everyone has an emotional connection to a school, whether you're an alum or you're a current student, of course. So the school board met on Wednesday night. They had a plan before them that was produced by a consultant they had hired that recommended closing certain schools, merging their students with other campuses, and even building some new schools. So Wednesday night there was a lot of passionate, public comment, particularly from students at Grace King and Metairie, which under this plan, those students will be sent to Riverdale or Bonneville High School, and Haynes Academy and Old Metairie currently will move into Grace King. So the board ended up essentially approving the plan that the consultants recommended to them, with one minor sort of change. They removed a school from it, Woods Elementary. But what's really guiding this is it's twofold. One of them is that the school district over the past few decades has seen its enrollment steadily drop. There are about 47,000 students in the district at the moment. Sort of at the height of Jefferson Parish Schools enrollment, there were around 70,000 students. At the same time, the sort of physical footprint of the school district hasn't really, adjusted to this drop in enrollment. So you have some schools that are, at only using half the space they have, and this is And so the board was sort of looking for ways to, optimize the use of the space.
And save money.
And save money, that's right. And their argument is that, well, if we can merge these schools, we can take those resources that we're currently spending to heat and cool and, maintain these other schools and put them back into the classroom.
Right. That's what the proponents of this say, that these savings could be redirected into education, directly into education. But it's a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of folks out there. And your heart kind of goes out to particularly like the senior class of next year's senior class of Grace King. They're not going to have that now. That's really unfortunate for them. And certainly for other students, too, are going to have to make these moves. We heard from students last night saying, this is really going to be kind of difficult. And, there are also school rivalries. What's it going to be like for these kids from one school to go to these two other schools? So it's a difficult situation. There was also some criticism from the Southern Poverty Law Center about this. So do we anticipate any kind of legal action against this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Southern Poverty Law Center put out an analysis basically saying that the schools targeted for closure have more black students than other schools. They're more. I think one of the more interesting comments from the night, though, was from former Judge Melvin Zeno, who said he used to serve in the 24th Judicial District Court, and he said that ahead of this vote he had been sort of talking to lawyers to sort of figure out if this would violate the law and bring a potential challenge. So we'll see. I mean, there's a lot more to be done on this school closure plan, and so I'm sure we'll see if there's a legal challenge.
Because it's come up pretty quickly. As you said, the consultant group took it on in February, and then their report was released in March. There were some public hearings, but the community said, still, we have not had enough input, and certainly they did yesterday. But the board made its decision.
That's right. Yeah, they did some meetings before the actual plan had been released, but the first chance that the public had to weigh in after hearing which schools would close was on Wednesday night, just before the board voted. So there was some criticism that they weren't really taking the public's input seriously.
Well, anytime you close a school, people are going to say,
Sure.
In a democracy of all elected positions, the toughest one is to be a school board member, especially in an urban area where you have a big, diverse population. You don't have much staff. You don't have much resources. You're close to everybody and next to them in the shopping center. It's a tough, tough job. And there's an old political adage about don't get between a mama bear and her cubs, okay? Yeah. Because it gets to be very volatile, but it's a different discussion. I'm wondering, Jefferson Parish, a lot of parishes are divided by the river to a certain extent, but Jefferson Parish is probably the most evenly divided by the river. And does that become kind of a Me Too-ism too? Like you have a West Jefferson school, you got to have an East Jefferson. You have a West Jefferson hospital, you have to have an East Jefferson hospital. I mean, is there more of that in making decisions, balancing them out between the parishes?
Well, I mean, the school closures, it affected both sides of the parish. So, I mean, and it consolidated the high schools on both sides. So, I mean, and that's kind of what's, I guess, difficult with a district that is, split by the Mississippi River, is you can't, you've got that boundary. One thing I'll say, though, is that some of the speakers last night said, this is political suicide for you guys to close these schools. But interesting thing is that, these board members were just elected. This is the start of a 4-year term. So, to think 4 years from now, will people even remember this?
Well, they're looking at the budget that they do have and what these costs are and how there could be savings, which I'm sure people would like to see these savings mostly turned into education improvement. That's the whole reason for the school system, is a good education for its students. Okay, we'll see where it all goes. Thanks a lot, Blair.
There are some school board members I've known when they're approaching the end of their first term, they're saying, thank God, okay? I mean, it's tough.
Because it's challenging. All right, Blake, thanks a lot. Okay, over to you, Jeff. And the state of Louisiana has been losing population, and unfortunately, 4 parishes in the state are sort of topping the list nationally.
Yeah, so it's been not a great couple of years for Louisiana population-wise. And in particular, as you said, 4 parishes, that St. John, St. Charles, Terrebonne, and Plaquemines were among the top 10 nationwide for the speed at which they're losing population. In St. John, it was more than 5% of their population left in the last year, according to the new census estimates. This isn't necessarily surprising, right? These estimates are for a period that covers the middle of 2021 to 2022. So obviously that includes Ida.
And of course, St. John was hit so hard there.
St. John was hit hard. Terrebonne was hit particularly hard. None of these parishes that are at the top of the list were really unscathed by Ida. And if you look at some of the other coastal parishes, they also posted a lot of pretty steep declines. But what's interesting is, or maybe a warning sign, is the parishes that didn't have as much of a direct effect from Ida, but are still losing a lot of population. And in particular, if you look at Jefferson Parish, which contributes to some of these issues that Blake's been talking about, and Orleans Parish, you're seeing a lot of people leaving both of those parishes. 8,000 in Jefferson, about 7,000 in Orleans. And obviously there were parts of Jefferson, like Grand Isle, where people weren't able to come back after the storm and are still rebuilding. But in a lot of cases, what this seems to be is people who either sort of reached their limit with Ida or in the last couple of years during the pandemic and decided to leave, or were forced out because, the ongoing insurance crisis, which is hitting in Orleans and Jefferson particularly badly, and people are seeing their premiums multiplied by 3 or 4 or 5 times what they were paying just a couple of years ago, and they can't afford to live here now.
So again, these numbers are from what years again?
This covers about summer 2021 to summer 2022.
Any pandemic effect there, you think?
There probably is, and both Orleans and Jefferson and a lot of other parishes throughout the state did see declines between 2020 and 2021 in the first part of the pandemic. What's really concerning is the fact that it's continuing, and we're not really seeing any of that ease off. It's not getting dramatically worse, but these are bad numbers for the area. Again, these are 15,000 people leaving the metro area in just a year.
And the statewide population now impacted too, obviously.
Yeah, the statewide population is down as well. We were one of the fastest shrinking states in the country, and this is after a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020 when we were growing, but we were one of the slowest growing states in the country. So this raises a lot of questions, I think, about the viability of what can be done to preserve the viability of both the New Orleans area and the state as a whole. And there's relatively few bright spots here. I mean, some of the what are called exurbs or second ring suburbs like St. Tammany, Ascension, Livingston, those are still growing a bit, although not nearly enough to cover for traditional suburbs like Jefferson and cities. Really, the only city or really urbanized area in the state that grew was Lafayette, which has been seeing pretty strong growth over the last 10 years. But they're just and I should point out we've been focusing on I've been focusing on urban areas, but rural areas have been really hard hit. Tensas and some of the other parishes sort of in central and northern Louisiana have been losing a lot of population, and they would be in some of these top 10 lists, except their population is now so small they don't even qualify as statistically relevant for those.
So in this metro loss, and these parishes are really in our metro area, and the 4 in the top 10 nationally, we really don't see them just going from one parish to another parish in the state.
No, and that's, there have been years and there have been censuses where you can see, Jefferson's losing population, but Tammany's gaining population, so you can make some pretty obvious connections there. But now, I mean, Tammany gained about 3,000 people over the last year, and, again, 15,000 people left Orleans and Jefferson, and 39,000 people left the state as a whole. So it's certainly not just people shuffling around within
from
the
parish
area.
to parish. Okay, yeah. All righty, Jeff, thanks a lot. E, over to you. Some good news. I mean, really, really good news. A national basketball championship for LSU women.
Yeah, and the playing the game and all of that is one story, but a different story here, okay? That's something that was really key to the growth in women's sports and doesn't really get the attention. There's something called Title IX. This was part of a law passed in 1972. Under the Nixon administration, every so often something comes up and was really good, and people say, it was Nixon that signed that. It's like, what? Okay.
Environmental things.
And I think the American Disabilities Act, and those kind of things.
Bush, yeah.
It's the Environmental Act. Anyway, what it did is it dealt with discrimination financially between the sexes, and essentially it says you can't do that. If you're receiving federal funds, you have to be equal in the amount of money that you spend between them. It's a very, very complex law, and it deals with the population you have in your area. But Title IX looks more at schools, and it tends to pinpoint universities. Kindergartens and first grades don't tend to have federal funds, okay? But universities all do, and so that's where the emphasis is. And it doesn't go to one sport and say, well, if you got a men's football team, you got to have a women's football team. It doesn't do that. But it looks at the amount of money spent and says you got to be equitable, that you got to distribute things. And so it may mean taking some money away from football, cutting back on scholarships, taking away from long road games, those kind of things, and cutting it down. Maybe cutting down on salaries and trying to build up other sports. And I think a prime example is basketball. It's the way that it's that basketball is built up. I mean, it's the one women's sport since then that there's really a pronounced pro level also now. With the emergence of women's basketball, and that was really since then. And so that was really the real boost. Kim Mulliken, who's the coach at LSU, gets paid $400,000 now, and that would have been like, that level would have been unheard of at one time. So that was the growth, and it's more attractive to the players because the players get better facilities. I mean, it says that if you got this kind of facility for the men, you got to have the same kind of thing for the women. And so I think that was the real impetus you're going to see, and we're going to see more of that type of growth in the future.
Yeah, it's still definitely room to grow in the future, but we really did see record-breaking numbers, of viewership and interest in the women's competition and the NCAA
and they're able to
competition.
the players are able to actually capitalize on it with these NIL deals now, which is new, and they really are. Angel Reese certainly is.
Yeah. So I mean, it was extremely exciting, and it was really great to see this interest in the women's program, and of course, just to watch the women compete. It was just really exciting to watch, and not to mention the coach. Pretty flamboyant coach, but she sure knows what she's doing, obviously. So congratulations.
But imagine too, if already won was it 4 titles at Baylor?
Three. This is the 4th.
Yeah,
so
okay.
3 at Baylor.
Okay, so she won 3 national titles before she even came here.
Yeah.
And so she's won 4 national titles.
And we should say neither the LSU men nor the women have ever even been to the final game, let alone won.
And then Kim Mulliken yourself was a competitor, a championship player as well. So really exciting to see. Okay, congrats to them again. All right, Steph, over to you. Let's talk about, we always criticize politics, politicians, nothing ever gets done, but it gets done, but it does kind of.
I wrote a column about this. I was inspired by kind of a panel I went to where some retired legislators, and I think they were right about some things. One was the 3-year rule that I mentioned, that, they're actually, Louisiana has a stronger consumer protection rule than anybody else in the country. Who would have thought when it comes to property insurance? Another one, I think John Bel Edwards will be talking about Monday because it is his proudest achievement. He talks about it all the time, and it is Medicaid expansion. And if you go back, the New York Times did a big story recently looking at the states that had not expanded yet. And we're down to only 10 of them. They've been kind of coming, online over time. Louisiana originally was not one of the states because Bobby Jindal was governor.
And it was part of Obamacare, let's say.
And it's part of Obamacare. Okay, good. The law was written so that this would be available in every state. The Supreme Court, when it upheld Obamacare, said states can decide. And this is when Obamacare was a real contentious issue. A lot of Republicans in politics said, we're not taking it. Bobby Jindal was one of them. What that meant was that there was at the time, 100% federally funded, chunk of money to pay for basically working poor people's health care, health insurance. John Bel Edwards campaigned on doing it. He did it on his first day. Probably the Republicans running would have done it. They all pretty much they probably would not have done it quite so triumphantly, but they would have done it because it makes financial sense and it makes sense for the health of our people. And one thing that really struck me about this list is Louisiana is so often negatively compared to places like Texas and Florida. Texas and Florida have not done this, and there's now data over time that shows that the things that John Bel Edwards talked about, that people can get preventive care, they can get cancer screenings, they can get,
it's been really far-reaching.
It's
and
a
just
lifesaver.
to sort of nudge you along a little bit, some other things that you want to discuss, because we're running out of time.
And it's, something else is that could come up in the legislative session. The little piece of the Stelly plan, if you remember that's left, which is that Louisiana does not charge state sales taxes on necessities, food, utilities, things like that. It is a little bit of a break in a tax structure that tends to be a little punishing towards poorer people. They pay a higher percentage of their taxes than other people. And this is something that voters passed 20 years ago or so, and they said it was a swap. It was supposed to be an income tax increase with a sales tax cut. The income tax increases have long since gone away, again under Bobby Jindal. Then we had the big $2 billion deficit, but we still have that tax break that is probably helping people.
Okay. So some things have been done.
Some things
that
have been
haven't.
done.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Real quick for other stories, guys. Real quick.
Well, there may be another LSU championship coming up with the women's gymnastics. They're going to be in the final for that. And of course, the big story is Olivia Dunn. Now that players can make money from promotional things, she's got over $1 million that she's made so far, and so she's got big numbers in both ways in terms of what she's making in the team's ranking.
All righty, Steph, over to you real quick.
Staying with sports, the Pelicans they're not in the playoffs yet, but they're at least in the play-in tournament that could lead to the playoffs.
Okay.
Go Pels.
Good luck to them. All right.
Something I'll be looking at is these efforts to restrict LGBTQ plus books has come to Jefferson Parish. A handful of books have been removed from the shelves, pending review. Unlike other places, there's no library board that oversees it. It's the parish president who can essentially decide. With the parish council can override that. But Cynthia Lee Shang said that she'll trust the people with the master's degrees in library sciences on this one. So.
Okay, we'll see where that goes. Jeff, over to you.
Sewage and Water Board is backing off a plan that would have cut off water to tenants if their landlords didn't pay their water bills. So that's something housing advocates have been pushing against for a while. It'll be interesting to see how Sewage and Water Board sort of handles their ongoing issues.
Okay, all right, guys. And we should note also for the opening session of the legislature, the governor's speech will be carried live on WYES, so you can see it there. All right, guys, thanks so much for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good weekend.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.